and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Socialism, Secularism, and Urban Modernity, Bombay's Waterfronts and Amitabh Bachchan's Deewaar. As usual, it's incredible that people are joining us today from several parts of the world, including New York, London, Bonn, Paisley, North Wales. Closer home, we will also have guests tuning in from Ahmedabad, Thimphu, Kolkata, Kharagpur, New Delhi, and of course, Mumbai. I'm going to keep this short. We have a great lineup today. Our speaker, Dr. Vandana Baweja, Associate Professor in the School of Architecture and the Sustainability Program at the University of Florida, Gainesville, will be looking at how the classic film Deewaar frames the city's waterfronts as key sites in the formation of Bombay's urban culture. Following her talk, Dr. Baweja will be in conversation with Dr. Mustansir Dalvi, Professor of Architecture at Sir J.J. College of Architecture and also Trustee Art Deco Mumbai Trust. So before I invite Professor Dalvi to introduce our speaker, let me say a few words about him. Professor Dalvi's PhD from the IIT Bombay IDC examined Bombay's Art Deco architecture from a semiotic perspective. He has also lectured, read, and published several papers on architectural education, architectural history and heritage, urban transformation, and architectural semiotics. Not to mention, he's also a poet and a bona fide Bachchan fan himself, so it was only befitting to have him join us this evening. Professor Dalvi, I now invite you to take the stage and introduce our speaker to everyone.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Right. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Baweja amongst us today, and I am really looking forward to a presentation on waterfronts as seen in the Hindi film Deewaar. Deewaar, for people of my vintage, is a very canonical, a very seminal kind of film. It kind of framed our youth and the times that we were growing up, along with two other films. One was Sholay, of course, and the other, which came a little later, was Amar Akbar Anthony. All these three films, in some form or the other, looked at or presented in a sense, almost a kind of unified view of socialism, secularism, and modernity, whether in an urban form or otherwise. And after more than 40 years, we look back at these films as archives of their own time. For us who grew through it, these were the presents during the mid-70s. And so on. So these are special to me and probably to people of my age. They also presented a very interesting view of Bombay, especially Amar Akbar Anthony and Deewaar. And that also is something to be discussed perhaps at the end of Dr. Baweja's lecture. The other very interesting point is the notion of the waterfront itself. We do know that the city of Bombay grew as a waterfront city right from its very inception. But we have to look at the waterfront not in isolation, but as part of the larger, shall we say, water edge, littoral edge of the western coast of India. So in a sense, it takes us to a time which is even prior to the time of this film, or even prior to the time of the 1930s, which is when Art Deco flourished. The interesting thing is that since the 1930s, I would suggest even until the present day, the architecture and the urban spaces that came up during the 30s form a backdrop to our own lives. This is an important aspect of the fact of our living in this city, and perhaps we can take this up with Dr. Baweja as well. But before we do that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to her. Dr. Vandana Baweja is an associate professor in the School of Architecture and the Sustainability Program at the University of Florida, Gainesville. She was trained as an architect in New Delhi, India, and got a master's in architecture at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London, followed by her PhD in architecture at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Her areas of research are global histories of tropical architecture, histories of sustainable architecture, and their representation in film and photography. Dr. Baweja is the co-editor of ARIS, the Journal of the Southeast chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians, published by the UNC Press. I look forward to Dr. Baweja's presentation on Bombay's waterfronts in Amitabh Bachchan's Deewaar. And I invite you now, Vandana, please make your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dalvi. It's an absolute honor and privilege to meet you via Zoom. I'm a huge fan of your book on G.B. Matre, and I've always wanted to meet you. So I have to thank the Art Deco Trust, Mumbai, to make this possible. And I will share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the waterfronts, Bombay's waterfronts as represented in Deewaar. And I would like to thank a couple of people and organizations that made this research possible. First of all is the Quest One program at the University of Florida, Gainesville. Quest One is a Gen Ed program which was started by my dear colleague, Dr. Angela Lindner, and this is a program that allows faculty to teach interdisciplinary classes. And it's because of this program I was able to teach a course on globalization in cities and cinema, which this talk is the outcome of. I researched this while teaching my class, and I'd also like to thank Dr. Andrew Wolpert, who's the director of the Quest One program, and it's been a huge undertaking implementing this program. And it's an absolutely wonderful program that allows faculty to teach outside their disciplines, outside their regular course load, in this manner, which in the School of Architecture, I would not have enough of an audience to teach a class on film and cinema and cities. So, and I'd also like to thank my husband, Stefan Reher, who always asks me very innocent questions about my work, about my writing, and kind of pushes me to really think more critically and go beyond the several assumptions that I make about certain things, especially when writing about India, because of the sense of sort of familiarity. So I'm going to start the presentation now. So what this paper does is that it analyzes the waterfronts in the Hindi film Deewaar, which I'm guessing most of you are familiar with. So I'm not going to belabor the story of the film or the narrative of the film. So what I'm doing here is I'm analyzing the representation of waterfronts in the context of three foundational ideals, that is the foundational ideals of the Indian nation state, which are secularism, socialism, and modernist urbanism. So what the film does is it depicts waterfront in a particular fashion, and waterfronts in the films are sites of historic globalization processes that have shaped the city's urban culture. And when I say historic globalization processes, I mean not just the colonial networks that emerged during the British colonization, but also the Indian Ocean networks that have existed along the western coast of India, connecting Surat to the Persian Gulf and East Africa. So the waterfronts in the film, that is Marine Drive, Malabar Hill, and Versova Beach, which are on the western coast of Bombay. And then you've got the docks and Ballad Estate on the east. These waterfronts comprise spaces of globalization that represent a certain tension that remained unresolved in the Nehruvian vision of modernism. So there was this tension between globalization and the three ideals of a Nehruvian modernity, that is socialism, secularism, and modernist urbanism. So the narrative of Deewaar ends with upholding the state's economic ideology that was actively geared at deglobalization. And I'll explain what deglobalization means later. The film celebrates the docks as a site of Bombay's secular cosmopolitan culture, but it also depicts the site docks as a symbol of the failure of the state's promise to build an equitable society, like roti kapda makan for all. And in Deewaar, you've got the glitzy waterfronts of Marine Drive and Nariman Point, which you see on the image on the still on the left. They represent aspirational urban icons of planned urbanism. But these icons failed sort of the Nehruvian promise of an equitable society. So when we view this east-west geography of Bombay and the kind of urban culture that is depicted in Deewaar, we look at waterfronts as spaces of globalization. And these illuminate the contradictions of Nehruvian statecraft with respect to globalization, social mobility, and cosmopolitan in the city of Bombay in the 1970s. So on one hand, the film celebrates the dock as the sites of Bombay's secular cosmopolitanism. And here you see Amitabh Bachchan and Rahim Chacha. But the docks are also a symbol of the state's failure in a sense. So, and there you see the glitzy waterfronts of Marine Drive and Nariman Point. So I'm going to continue showing how these waterfronts represent the contradictions of Nehruvian statecraft. So let's first of all begin with what I mean by the globalization networks that existed prior to the establishment of British colonial rule and the development of Bombay. So here you see the Indian Oceanic trade networks that connect the western coast of India to the Swahili coast, the Persian Gulf, and these networks have existed for centuries before the European colonization of India. And Surat was the key port on the western coast that was connected to the Swahili coast and the Persian Gulf through the Arabian Sea. And after the British moved their operations from Surat to Bombay, Bombay became this new port that took over, that started sort of establishing new sort of trade network. It started building on the older trade networks that Surat had been operating with. And since most of you are familiar with the history of Bombay, I'm not going to explain that in detail. But until the mid-19th century, Bombay grew in a south to north axis along the peninsula around Fort George that was constructed by the British East India Company in 1769. And here you can see a map of Bombay before Marine Drive was built. And you see the Maidans on the waterfront. You see the Ballad Estate on the eastern coast, and you see the back bay where a Marine Drive would be eventually constructed. And this is the fort area, and you can see this east-west geography that developed in Bombay during its development as a colonial city. So you've got the Bombay Harbor on the east, and therefore the docks, and you've got spaces of leisure and recreation on the the western side, with the exception of the Taj Mahal Plaza and the India Gate. A lot of the eastern waterfronts were dedicated to the docks and to shipping, which was, of course, like really central to the colonial trade. So what I want to first walk you through like what I mean by high-end and low-end globalization, because that's really crucial to understanding this east-west geography of waterfronts that's depicted in Deewaar. So during the colonial rule, we had this what we call high-end globalization, which are kind of macroeconomic flows, which comprised Malwa opium smuggled into China, which was legal in the British India, illegal in China. And then you had cotton yarn exported to China, and you had raw cotton that was supplied from the Indian Deccan region to the Lancashire mills. And then you had exports of mineral ores, grains, animal hides, and you had imports of manufactured goods from England, Arabian imports such as pearls, raw silk, Carmania wool, dates, and dried rose water, coffee, gold, honey, and other via Muscat, Ormuz, and Basra, which generated capital for the kind of urban infrastructure and industrial development of Bombay in the 19th century. So we're all familiar with how the American Civil War fueled the growth of the urban growth of Bombay with the realization of the Frere Plan. And in addition to these colonial macroeconomic colonial trade flows, we also had an indigenous Indian Ocean economy via networks that existed prior to the European colonial rule. So you had the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and the Swahili coast that were actively connected to Surat. And finally, as Bombay displaced Surat, Bombay was connected to all of these places through the Arabian Sea, and the native Indian merchants served as intermediaries between colonial shipping and trading enterprises in port cities. And they were also intermediaries in the hinterland triumvirate of peasants, agricultural traders, and money lenders. But these kind of brokerage roles were not only taken up by merchants in India, but also in the regions of Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and the Swahili coast. So there was an active cultural exchange and interchange through these regions in the Indian Ocean during and prior to the colonial rule. So we're familiar with sort of the formal and informal economy and formal and informal urbanism in the present day context. But during the colonial rule, you also had this kind of distinction between the bazaar economy and the Indian capitalist who operated within the framework of the British colonial rule. So the Indian capitalists sort of ran their own mercantile shipping and finance networks, and they, the formal sort of mercantile class, they ran their business models according to European corporate models and credit flows. And parallel to this existed an informal globalization network known as the bazaar economy and the bazaar businesses, which were kinship-based establishments, and they could be anywhere from informal to illegal. And these were indigenous commercial practices where you have personal and familial money lending networks, and you have indigenous negotiable credit instruments such as hundis, and they kind of operate through ethnosocial trade nexuses. And after independence, these networks would still continue. It's not that they were abolished during colonial times or after independence, But I want you to pay close attention to legal flows of globalization, macroeconomic or high-end globalization, and this kind of low-end globalization or illegal globalization, which would be smuggling, the import of goods across national borders. So what we have in Deewaar is this east-west geography. And if we look at what these waterfronts represent, this eastern waterfronts and western waterfronts, we kind of begin to see the economic stratifications, how the economic stratifications of colonial Bombay were mapped spatially onto the city to create an urban geography of formal and informal urbanism, which corresponds to the spaces of high-end and low-end globalization. So on the western coast of Bombay, you have elite colonial spaces such as the Gothic Ensemble, the Elphinstone Circle, the Flora Fountain, Marine Drive, which were all part of South Bombay. And these spaces of high-end globalization are the products of international technological capital and cultural flows. And on the other hand, you see spaces of low-end globalization, such as the bazaars, the docks, which are both spaces of high-end and low-end globalization. So you have these spaces that exist in very, very close proximity. If you look at the peninsula, the archipelago of Bombay, these are like two different universes which are mapped onto the city, and you can the spatial proximity is just amazing, and you can't really experience it through the map or images till you actually go to Bombay and experience this in person. So with the independence of India in 1947, Bombay continued to be the financial capital of the newly formed Indian nation state. Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, adopted, I want to focus on 5 foundational ideologies: democracy, the socialist economy, a state-sponsored developmentalist modernization agenda, planned urbanism, and secularism. So the promise of the Nehruvian utopian state was geared on the creation of a classless society, which was the basis of the socialist economy. And the repudiation of provincial registers of identity, such as kinship, religion, caste, ethnicity, and regional languages. So the nation state was formed, we all know that Indian nation state was formed through the union of numerous ethno-linguistic provinces, which were further fragmented along religious and caste fault lines. So the ideals of Nehruvian citizenship were forged through privileging the individual's allegiance as a citizen to the state over the person's loyalty to social groups such as family, caste, religion, and linguistic ethnicity. And as Dr. Dalvi pointed out, we see these ideals of citizenship reflected in a number of Bombay films like Amar Akbar Anthony, and Deewaar, of course, where you have Shashi Kapoor, the brother, who privileges his allegiance to the nation state over allegiance to kinship. That is, he kills his brother at the end of the movie, and the movie ends with the fratricide, the killing of Amitabh Bachchan. So now, in the Nehruvian calculus, the city of Bombay had a peculiar position. So on one hand, until the 1990s, Bombay was considered India's most cosmopolitan city, and thus emblematic of Nehruvian secularism. Now, Bombay is a very unique city where you have numerous ethno-linguistic, religious, and caste-based population clusters in very, very close spatial proximity. So Bombay is often described as a rich mosaic of provincial factions, which make it an incredible site of cultural cosmopolitanism. And it's in that sense, it's really unique. It's a unique city in India because of this very, very compressed space in which all of these communities exist in close proximity. So this kind of spatial proximity made the city a microcosm of the Indian state. with the caveat that many of these communities did in the past and continue to inhabit unplanned and organic settlements. So you've got slums, you've got organic waterfront villages, the Koli fishing villages. And these were Nehru's bane in the arena of modern urbanism and infrastructure. Nehru wanted all of India to be urbanized, modernized with sort of planned, gridded urban cities, and slums were Nehru's bane. So when we look at the Bombay of the 1970s, on one hand, Bombay was the site of tension between the socialist and globalist economies, as it became the principal entrepot of gold smuggling from Dubai into India, which takes place on these prior Indian Ocean networks. And you've got the tension between indigenous mercantile capitalism and the global economy. So I call the global economy a kind of economic cosmopolitanism, right? The desire to move goods freely across borders of nation state. And that is a recurring phenomena in the city's history. So you've got a triumvirate of conflicts between cultural versus economic cosmopolitanism, informal versus formal infrastructure, informal versus formal urbanism, and then you've got high-end and low-end globalization. So these tensions form the basis of the waterfronts in Deewaar. So we've got economic cosmopolitanism versus cultural cosmopolitanism. That's quite a mouthful. I should have thought about it. You got formal versus informal urbanism and infrastructure. And then finally, you've got high-end versus low-end globalization. So let's look at socialism as the foundational ideology. And you know, by the 1970s, when Deewaar is made, people were beginning to develop the black market economy and all kinds of illegal and informal economic networks, which subverted socialist economy. So from the 1950s to through the 1970s, through successive regulation, the Nehruvian economy became insular in an attempt to become self-sufficient, and through this kind of an economic ideology, the Indian nation state actively withdrew from global free market capitalism. So this is what I call the deglobalization of the economy. So you had very, very tight controls on the borders. We were not part of the global free trade. And I know this really well from growing up in India at that time. The Nehruvian promise of an equitable society relied on distributive measures, as in distributive of like a tax money. So you had like high individual taxes, corporate taxes, foreign exchange control, limitations on the free import of goods, nationalization of banks, and state monopoly on the industrial sector, and the labor participation in industrial enterprises, which, despite being very well-intentioned, failed due to depressed growth and corruption. And I think Dr. Dalvi and I could relate very well to having this state monopoly on the industrial sector. Like you had one channel, Doordarshan, growing up, and you had only two cars, Fiat or Ambassador, and you had to wait years and years to get a car or a phone. And when I discuss these with my husband, he tells me that's what it was like in East Germany. So he grew up in West Germany and he had family. They would go to East Germany, and that's what it was like in East Germany. So he understands what I grew up with. So by the time we come to 1970s, which is when Deewaar is set, it is sort of set in the era of emergency. But if we look at like global economic events, geopolitical events that took place at this time, there was the OPEC crisis. And at this time, the attempt to become a self-sufficient closed economy had an opposite effect, which was made worse by OPEC crisis. So you had scarcities of fossil fuels, construction materials, food, housing, and job opportunities, which made things, which was just the opposite of what Nehru intended. So in the 1970s, if we look at like what comprised the illegal economy in Bombay, you have a spectrum of activities that include white collar, petty and organized crime. So white collar crime is sort of, underreporting corporate profits, evading taxes, wage theft, like not paying people proper wages, underpayment of import duties, levies, and doing real estate transactions via untaxed cash, which we all know that exists in India even now. Like, when you buy a house or something, you pay white money and black money. And then you've got petty crime, which includes like violations on a small scale, like theft. So if you remember Deewaar, there's that guy who steals bread. You've got theft, pickpocketing, shoplifting, which is petty crime. And these are the kind of crimes in which individuals act independently. So these are not professional hardcore criminals, and they often turn to crime due to a kind of poverty-induced desperation. And then you've got organized crime, which includes the black market sale of commodities, hoarding up of fuel, construction materials, and selling them in the black market, particularly cement. If you remember Trishul, Prem Chopra is this guy who hoards cement. And then it goes all the way to mafia crimes like murder, extortion, kidnapping. And then, of course, in the 70s, you've got the smuggling of gold, diamonds, and foreign luxury goods. And, of course, money laundering. So gold smuggling from Dubai along the historic Indian Ocean routes became a key component of organized crime. After the 1962 Chinese attack, India imposed gold control rules to restrict gold trade, and the 1965 Gold Control Act prohibited the ownership of bullion, which led to the illegal import of gold. And of course, people would hoard black money in gold. So with the exponential rise in black money and the devaluation of the Indian rupee, gold smuggling increased dramatically. During the late 1960s and 1970s, at the height of socialism, Bombay became a hub of illegal global trade, which comprised principally the smuggling of luxury goods and gold. And it is in this context, this sort of tension of globalization and socialism that Deewaar is sort of, the premise of Deewaar is in this tension. And so the waterfronts that form the film's mise-en-scène sit uneasily within the Nehruvian political ideals and the unpredictable and uncontrollable effects of the global economy. In this anti-colonial economy of nationalization and deglobalization, in which the state controlled the flow of goods and capitals at the border, the smuggling of gold via Bombay constituted an illicit form of global trade. And there you see how the Nehruvian ideals had an unresolved relationship with globalization. On one hand, Nehruvian economic policies were geared at nationalization. But on the other hand, the urban modernist ideals were ideologically grounded in globalization. So the idea of modernist urbanism, modernist architecture is very much grounded in the idea of this kind of like a global modernity. And if you look at Deewaar, it depicts the transformation of Vijay from a blue-collar dock worker into a smuggler who is entrenched in Bombay's crime world. So as a coolie, Vijay unloads cargo from the ships that enter Bombay legally. And while working on the dock, he befriends an older Muslim mentor, Rahim Chacha. And Rahim Chacha informs Vijay that his villa, the coolie tag is coolie identification tag is numbered 786, a number that is auspicious to Muslims. So Vijay, who's sort of a non-practicing Hindu in the film, treats the villa as a talisman after Rahim Chacha assures him that Allah would protect him as long as he had his Billa 786. And you see this kind of friendship between a Muslim and a non-practicing Hindu, where he sort of starts believing in Rahim Chacha's assurance that the Billa would protect him. And you see throughout the film that it protects him. And at the end, when he dies, he loses his Billa. So you see this kind of cosmopolitanism and this kind of camaraderie, friendship and mentorship that cuts across class, religious lines, ethno-linguistic lines. And so through this friendship between Rahim Chacha and Bachchan Vijay, Deewaar depicts the port infrastructure as a historic site of both high-end and low-end globalization. And we see the waterfront, the docks waterfront, as a site of both legal and illegal trade of high-end and low-end globalization. So the harbor comprises planned infrastructure that sort of combines these formal and informal spaces. And the history of port infrastructure represents both high and low end globalization through global flows of capital, technology, and expertise, which comprise high end globalization, and low end globalization through the confluence of diverse emigre labor cultural practices. So what I mean by diverse emigre labor cultural practices is the kind of architecture and bazaar urbanism that you see adjoining the dock areas, which unite Indian oceanic cultures and hinterland cultures from the Indian mainland. So Vijay's faith in his Billa 786 and his friendship with Rahim Chacha is not just emblematic of the dock's history as a site of low-end cultural mixing and exchange, but also an embodiment of existing Nehruvian secular ideas and Bombay's status as the most cosmopolitan city. Rahim Chacha represents the pedigree of Bombay's Muslim emigre workforce from Konkan and Hyderabad, who not only contributed a significant portion of the dock labor from 1870s to the 1910s, but were also part of the Indian oceanic religious economy. So if you look at religious networks like Hajj, and if you look at the networks which made Haji Ali possible in Bombay, so Rahim Chacha is sort of the epitome of all of those aspects of globalization. And the presence of Rahim Chacha on the docks embodies the spatial topography of the city, where key Muslim enclaves are situated close to the waterfront, including Bhendi Bazaar, Muhammad Ali Road, Hazrat Abbas Road. By 1970s, these locales had become home to a mercantile diaspora of Shia Ismaili Bohras and Khojas, Sunni Memons, and Iranian emigres from Shiraz and Yazd. So the key cultural attributes of these communities, that is religious piety, architecture, street culture, and food, all represent products of low-end cultural globalization, which occurred along these global mercantile networks that linked Bombay to the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and the Swahili coast. So in Deewaar, the waterfront infrastructure is not just a site of restricted legal global trade, that is where the nation state draws its borders, but it's also shown as a stepping stone for blue-collar workers like Vijay and petty criminals into the world of organized crime. So since you've all seen the movie, you know that Vijay rebels against Hafta, and that elevates into a cult hero at the docks and gains an entrance to the smuggling syndicate of Deewaar, which heralds his transition from an agent of legal to illegal globalization. The docks, as a site of low-end globalization, represent the dysfunction and triumphs of the Nehruvian state vis-a-vis globalization. The docks as a location of exploited labor, mafia extortion, illicit global trade, and informal habitation are sites that are depicted as failures of the Nehruvian promise. But the friendship between Rahim Chacha and Vijay that the docks foster represent the success of secularism. So the docks become a site that represent the tension between cultural and economic cosmopolitanism. These are spaces that mark the border of the nation state, and the docks and their associated infrastructure are spaces that depict the limits of the Nehruvian project of a developmental, equitable state. So now, when we recall the scene in which Vijay is inducted into Deewaar's organized crime syndicate, the smuggling ring, it was shot in an upper story room on Marine Drive, which is, so in this shot, you see Vijay on the right, you see Vijay gazes out of the window to admire the panoramic view of the seafront. And in the process, he reminisces about his homeless childhood with his mother and brother on the promenade, which you see on the left. So Marine Drive represents this urban space that he could formerly only access as a homeless pedestrian. And now Vijay has this vantage point from a high-rise building, and he overlooks Marine Drive from the privileged vantage point of as a member of the elite society who has access to this interior space in these very highly priced buildings, the Art Deco ensemble on Marine Drive that you see. And however, to cross these class barriers that the nation state promised to erase, Vijay relinquishes the path of making an honest, lawful living. And as Vijay establishes himself as a successful gold smuggler, he invests his profits into a lavish bungalow, buys a skyscraper on the site where his mother was employed as a construction worker. And this sort of buying of the skyscraper, or a high-rise building, I should say, not a skyscraper, underscores how illicit global capital and black money drove the construction industry in Bombay. And along with the architecture that Bachchan inhabits, we see a transformation of his dress, mannerisms, and persona from a blue-collar worker to a very suave elite buyer of global consumer products that were exorbitantly priced and out of reach for most Indians at that time. And now once Vijay becomes Bachchan becomes a smuggler, we see him navigating the world of glitzy waterfront skyscrapers. And this is a scene in which they're dining around the rooftop swimming pool of the 5-star Oberoi Trident Hotel. And Vijay meets with Deewaar's gang, Iftikhar, to plan smuggling operations. And you see these long shots, which you have the characters in the foreground with Malabar Hill and Marine Drive in the background. And Marine Drive is, of course, it's an iconic waterfront, but it's also a key piece of urban infrastructure that connects spaces of high-end globalization, that represents a space of high-end globalization with its Art Deco architecture in its interwar heyday. Marine Drive represents the agency of semi-sovereign actors such as Maharajas and Parsi entrepreneurs in India who built Marine Drive, Parsi engineers, construction companies, the Maharajas who were patrons of many of these buildings. So Marine Drive represents this kind of planned urban ensemble that would later become emblematic of Nehruvian modernity in the sphere of urbanism. So on one hand, these elite waterfronts are the products of large-scale land reclamation, engineering expertise, and architectural spectacle, which make them icons of Bombay's cosmopolitanism. On the other hand, these spaces in the movie, these spaces seduced Vijay into the murky world of illicit globalization, where the lines between legal, illegal, national, international, moral, right, and wrong become blurred. So this elite waterfront undermines the promise of the new Indian social order, which was premised on commitments to democracy and equality. So we also have other waterfronts like Versova Beach, which is on the northwestern coast of Bombay. And that in the movie is depicted as an entry point for maritime gold smuggling from Dubai. So merchants in Dubai would purchase bullion legally, which was shipped from London, Zurich, and Beirut, and then arrange for the bullion to be shipped to Bombay via Indian dhows, which are wooden sailing ships called padaus. And the padaus did not enter the Bombay port via the docks, which were the legal entry points for maritime trade in the Indian nation state, but often transferred their contraband to fishing boats, which then dropped it off on deserted beaches at night. So here you see in Deewaar, when the gold is offloaded on Versova Beach, the two parties, the shipping and the receiving mafia gangs, each would have one half of a Bank of England currency bill as verification of their identities. When the torn edges of the bill are perfectly aligned, the contraband is offloaded on the beach. And if you look at the material culture of this Bank of England bill, it signifies this ongoing dominance of not only hard currency, as a legacy of British colonialism, which is now linked to illicit trade. And finally, the climax of the film is set at Ballad Estate, where Ravi chases Vijay and shoots him. George Whitted was the architect of Indo-Saracenic icons such as Gateway of India, Prince of Wales Museum, designed Ballad Estate as a business district, and it is a Beaux-Arts ensemble with very strict elevation controls and height limits. And the key buildings in the Ballad Estate include Construction House, the Darbashah House, Neville House, Mahindra House, Customs Building, and the old Bombay Trust buildings. This ensemble is marked by features such as arcades, low-level rusticated masonry, friezes, and ornate column capitals. And here you see a chase that takes place in this arcade. And you have Ravi chasing Vijay through a rusticated masonry arcade. So this Ballad Estate was sort of the epicenter of regulating global trade. It had the offices of the Port Trust and the Customs House, which were the gatekeepers of the territorial borders of Bombay. And as an agent of the state, the Indian nation state, Ravi rejects his kinship loyalty to uphold his allegiance to the nation state. And Vijay, as an agent of illicit global trade, that is global smuggling, is shot, and he eventually dies in a temple that he rejected all his life, which kind of signifies a return to dharma, one's moral duty, which is then conflated at the end with one's dharma to the national state. So the movie ends with an effort to restore narrative equilibrium in which the seductive lure of globalization, skyscraper-lined glitzy waterfronts, and capitalist consumerism is negated, and the nation state triumphs as the agent for the enforcement of public good. Deewaar depicts this kind of urban socio-spatial nexus of white-collar, petty, and organized crime through conflicting representation of waterfronts as liminal spaces of modern infrastructure that are the sites of tension between cultural versus economic cosmopolitanism, informal versus formal urbanism, and high-end versus low-end globalization. Although the closure of the narrative restores the nation state's controls over its waterfronts that are spaces of infrastructure and also make the state's borders, the film sort of fails to resolve the internal contradictions of the nation state's foundational Nehruvian tenets, that is socialism, secularism, and urban modernity. And ab samachar samapt hue. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. It's full of very interesting insights, and your commentary raises several issues that I think we can try and unfold. If you don't mind, I'd just like to begin by making one small distinction about the Western waterfront, particularly in line with your thesis about the Nehruvian ideals. Because I think the Western waterfront should be seen as divided into two parts. One is the Marine Drive, the Queen's Necklace, which was actually completed by 1940. So it is very much part of the colonial larger construct. But I think the notion of the Nehruvian state can definitely be seen in the extension of the Marine Drive, which is the Nariman Point, which is something, which is something that was also coming up both in terms of reclamations as well as in terms of the high-rise business district right into the 70s. And there were big controversies about land, and the whole Nariman Point thing was as murky as anything. Very beautifully described by Gyan Prakash in Mumbai Fables. So here is what you get. You get these Nariman Point type buildings, which are part of the post-independence modernization and globalization, because it is, after all, an international modernism, the architecture which comes up at that time. But that is the place which gives you the vantage point to look at a slightly older Bombay, which is the Queen's Necklace itself. And the iconic scenes in Deewaar, in fact, they almost valorize the Queen's Necklace as both a public space where even a homeless person can walk down, and an urban backdrop through which we understand the city. So I just wanted to point out this distinction between these two parts of the western edge of Bombay.
Thank you for that. I mean, because of the time limits of this talk and the book chapter in which this was included, I wasn't able to go into this kind of granular detail, but as I develop this further, that's a really good feedback to kind of incorporate that distinction. So I'm really thankful to you for making that observation, that you have this Art Deco ensemble, and then Marine Drive is like, you've got the Nariman Point, you've got the Express building and icons of 1950s modernism, which you see in some of the Amol Palekar films like Chori Si Baat, which show you that kind of corporate culture and nation state and that kind of cosmopolitanism. So that's an excellent observation. Thank you.
It's also a very interesting infiltration of the informal or the illegal economy into the space of the elite corporate kind of space, because you find how easily the smugglers can have access to some of the high rises. In this particular case, the Oberoi Sheraton, as it was known at that time, has gone through a variety of names. But when we were children, it was the Oberoi Sheraton. And the photographs or the filming in the high-rise building, both I think in terms of the swimming pool scenes as well as in terms of Deewaar's room, are both from the hotel spaces over there, which essentially just tells us that money talks, and it doesn't matter what kind of money it is, but in this case, money talks.
Absolutely.
Another interesting point which I would like to make is also in terms of looking at the extension of the Nehruvian project, because by the time we come to the time frame of Deewaar, which is 1975 and so on, Nehru has been gone for more than 10 years, and this is essentially Indira Gandhi's country. In terms of her immense kind of influence over everything that happened at that time. And two things which happened. One is her drive towards nationalism, which is a form of deglobalization, I suppose, where she nationalizes banks and things like that. And her curbs on the movement of gold, which create a certain vacuum which gets filled up by global smuggling, by gold smuggling, which becomes the kind of centerpiece, MacGuffin, shall we say, of Deewaar itself. I think this is an interesting thing, because more than the period in which Nehru was prime minister, here you now have the aftermath. In a sense, many things are crumbling, many things are breaking down. The emergency is, of course, a sign of perhaps the loss of innocence that came with the optimism that that independence brought with it. The 70s, we started looking at, things were not as fine as we thought they might be. And here is a space where the legal and the illegal exist side by side to the point that they're almost equal. So this
Absolutely.
is something that comes out in the film and in your presentation both quite well.
Yeah, that's because of time limitations, I didn't, and because most of us on this talk are a literate audience who know the emergency, so I didn't sort of delve into that. When I talked about the Nehruvian economy, I meant the legacy of a Nehruvian economy that was subsequently enacted upon by, that was sort of taken to another extreme by Indira Gandhi, of course. Nehru was no longer alive, but it's sort of carrying his principles to another extreme level and continuing that notion of deglobalization and withdrawal from global trade networks. And then you see this form of resistance to, almost a form of resistance to those economic policies in the form of smuggling. And then it kind of fuels real estate, and it further then deepens the kind of inequities that this economic ideology was supposed to fix. When I tell my friends that real estate prices in Bombay are like Manhattan, they don't believe it, but that is the case. If I were living in Bombay, I could not afford to buy a flat on my American salary.
That's probably true. It's probably costlier than Manhattan.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder whether we should also bring in the idea of the rise of certain cities in the Middle East, particularly Dubai. Because that becomes, although it is never, I think, very overtly mentioned in this film, but if Dubai did not exist, perhaps Deewaar would not have existed. So in a sense, this is the time, I think you mentioned the OPEC crisis and so on, but you also had the policies of the people in the UAE who decided to create a city with a large amount of migrant population. And we see how it has developed over the last 40 years or so, in a sense, perhaps gone ahead to what Bombay was at that time. In the 70s, Dubai was emerging from being just a bit of a backwater kind of place. But the fact that it attracted such a lot of immigrants, especially from India, I think is key to the rise of the connect between these two countries, especially when it comes to the informal networks of movement of people and materials and goods.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. I mean, a lot of Indian labor, craftsmen and artisans went to Dubai and had lucrative jobs that weren't available to them in India in construction. And that, you're right, that then creates like these new cultural and economic networks, especially religious networks, which then form these new linkages along which gold smuggling then is sort of fueled because of Dubai's status and their sort of decision to get gold from London, Zurich, and all of these places legally, and then become this kind of hub for smuggling it to India. Yeah, that's an excellent observation. I mean, it's I mean, I guess Dubai is sort of this ghost in a lot of films at this point. Like it's somewhere out there. We know about its existence. And then, of course, if you look at like the history of the expansion of mafia networks, then Dubai, of course, takes an altogether different place in illicit globalization with respect to Bombay. But that's sort of, I guess that would be unpacked with a film like Once Upon a Time Bombay or some of the other films that specifically address this kind of like crime, organized crime networks between Bombay and Dubai.
But it's even more contradictory, I think, than that, because there is an entirely legal aspect to Dubai as well, because it has represented from its time and right until today the fact of a lot of funds which actually flow in legally as the people who go and work there send back their earnings, remittances into India in a variety of ways, perhaps all along the coast. And they, in fact, fund the economies of the people in more or less the middle class or the lower middle class, simply because those remittances are probably much greater than what they could earn in similar jobs over here. And side by side, you have the smuggling kind of networks in the 70s, which very interestingly seem to be almost unself-consciously happening right, cheek by jowl, so to speak.
Absolutely.
I think there's a lot, there's a lot more that one can take out of a discussion of a film like this. I just have one more point to make, I think, before we can open out the discussion to the audience that is present, and that is the idea which you began with, the fact of the Indian Ocean being a kind of a connector between all the cities that dot or that line the Indian Ocean, especially all the port cities, because that takes us to a point which is much earlier than Bombay itself. And we don't really, we tend to look at Bombay in isolation, but for me, at least, when I do my research and all that, I always look at Bombay as part of the larger western coast, because it's just one harbor away from the mainland. When we look at the Western coast, you start seeing certain tropes, especially of cosmopolitanism, of secularism, of a kind of religious synthesis, which is there all along the Western coast. Whether you take it from Gujarat or you take it right down to Kerala, you tend to see certain similarities. You tend to see people of different religions living side by side in very, very interesting ways. And in a very small way, that is in fact depicted in Deewaar. So, a single Muslim becomes a kind of metonymy of the entire community of Muslims, probably in India, which is interesting. I mean, if you look at it in great detail, there is one Muslim in Deewaar and there is one Christian in Deewaar who has the unfortunate job of getting beaten up, and that's about all. But otherwise, largely all the names are more or less upper class Hindu. But despite that, you do have the Western coast, which is where the conflation, which is where the synthesis of people of different religions, whether Hindu, Muslim, the Jewish people, Parsis, Sikhs would all be there side by side. And I think to a large extent that is also because of the networks that almost are, primordial almost, shall we say, between the cities that line the western coast of India and the other parts of the Indian Ocean. So I'm just wondering how, we can look at Deewaar as part of that larger notion, because in one sense, it's all about the migrant experience. One can make a case that every actor in Deewaar, or every character in Deewaar, is a migrant in one sense, and every character in Deewaar is trying to make the best of a city like Bombay that allows the migrants to come and develop their own lives.
Well, I think when you look at the docks as a space, you begin to see some historic and contemporary manifestations of this Indian Oceanic culture. And although in the film you never really go into the Muslim mohallas, which very directly developed from due to culture contact with Indian Ocean port cities, Rahim Chacha then sort of becomes an emblem representing all of those. So we don't know his origins. Like, he could be somebody who's somebody who came from the hinterland, or he could be somebody who came from one of the Indian Ocean ports, or his ancestors might have come. So in Deewaar, we kind of see a flattening of all of those diverse Muslim communities that make up Bombay. So, Bombay is this like mosaic of Muslim communities that have very, very specific origins, and they all sort of assimilate into the city, and we kind of lump them as like one Muslim community, but actually, like, there's an incredible richness and diversity to them. And in that sense, like, Deewaar sort of flattens that representation. And if you were to analyze what Rahim Chacha represents, he could represent a Muslim who comes from the Konkani region as an emigre who came to India, who came to the city of Bombay looking for work, as you mentioned. Or he could be a descendant of the emigres who were part of the mercantile networks that extend from Bombay into the Indian Ocean, into the Persian Gulf, and all the way to the Red Sea. So we kind of have that flattening of that identity, and he could like represent any of those. We don't know, and I think that kind of flattening of identities happens in films to a certain extent. Like we have, I mean, if you look at Amitabh Bachchan and Shashi Kapoor, they also kind of to some extent like are very. They represent, I mean, Nirupa Roy in some sense represents the nation state. And then you've got Amitabh Bachchan and Shashi Kapoor who represents Ravi's like an agent of the nation state, whereas Vijay becomes like this smuggler. I mean, in real life, like where would you see that in a family, like a smuggler brother and a police inspector, being two brothers? But that's kind of like what the movie represents. The Nirupa Roy is like the nation state, and her two kids who represent these opposing trajectories of what Nehruvian ideals, and they sort of clash head on in 1970s India, which is the kind of milieu that you were talking about. And so you see how that plays out in the movie, and how it sort of ends with this idealistic notion of the nation state being triumphant.
But thank you so much for this discussion and the presentation. Like I said, it raises several very, very interesting points. And with your permission at this point, I'd like to call in Suhasini, if we can take questions from the audience and expand this discussion a bit.
I'm going to jump right in. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Vandana, for your presentation. It was a great illustrative sort of walkthrough of Deewaar, even though I've seen it a couple of times, but I think you really sort of brought in aspects of the film that I would never have thought of. Having lived in Bombay, having watched Deewaar, these are aspects that I would not have considered. We have a couple of questions from the audience. We're running a little short on time, so I'm going to keep this precise. So the first one, this is a basic one, but I think it's an important one, which is, what are the specific elements about Deewaar that made you pick this film over many of the other Bachchan Salim Javed films of this era, which deal with similar themes of urban modernity, the state, and secularism, and are also happen to be set in Bombay? So what drew your attention to Deewaar specifically over the other films?
Well, I'm actually working on all of them, and so far I've just managed to publish on Deewaar. So this is work in progress, and I'm going to teach my class starting in August to December again, and that is when I'm going to be writing about Amar Akbar Anthony and Dawn.
Okay.
So I kind of take up one movie per semester. Okay. So as I'm teaching the class, I kind of complete a chapter. So it happens once a year. So 3 years from now, we'll have 3 more.
Okay, we look forward to that then. This is another one. This, I think, would be a good question for Prof as well, which is, whenever the Art Deco ensembles appear in the film, it's usually as a representation of aspiration or wealth. But Art Deco appears in the city in several different typologies and across the spectrum of at least the middle classes. So could you shed light on some of these variations in the neighborhoods that the style appears in, and the various forms that it can take in the city, apart from just being a symbol of aspiration or wealth?
Shall I answer that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think what you look at, in one sense, we have assimilated Art Deco in our own subconscious as a series of perhaps not very well defined, but nostalgic kind of images, and then we tend to look at everything from that kind of lens. But if you look at it more specifically, you will notice that these very spaces have been part of our cinema, Hindi films especially, for a very, very long time. Right from the time that they were coming up, which is the time that cinema, started taking off in a very, very big way. So if you look at films from the late 1940s and the 1950s, You go back to say films like Devanand's Taxi Driver, or several of the other Guru Dutt Noir kind of films, CID, R Par, and so on. You look at very interesting cult films like Kishore Kumar's Mr. X in Bombay.
Yeah.
And then you come to more or less the 70s, and you even look at films like, you mentioned Amol Palekar, Vandana. You look at Rajni Gandha, or you look at Choti Si Baat, or you look at Baaton Baaton Mein, and so on. You will tend to see these very same backdrops. The Art Deco buildings along the Marine Drive, the Art Deco buildings along the Oval Maidan, cinema theaters by themselves as individual sites of Art Deco-ness, so to speak. So to me, it is not really aspirational. To me, it is the backdrop to life. Okay, to me, even now, and I'm sure to a lot of your audience, if you ask them to imagine Bombay in their minds, it is very likely that they imagine Bombay with an Art Deco backdrop. And that is not because it is titled Art Deco, or it is, it is now kind of made into a big thing. But this is something that has got, over, as we have grown up through these places, it has got embedded in our consciousness. And the urban fabric that we imagine Bombay to be is, in fact, the urban fabric that came up in the 30s and 40s.
Right. Vandana, would you like to take that?
Sure. So I think there are sort of multiple representations of Marine Drive in Deewaar. On one hand, it represents this space that is accessible. It's very cosmopolitan. So you have this homeless immigrant who is walking on the space with her kids. And if we look at present day Bombay, where there's a lot of policing of public spaces, for example, you can no longer walk along the sidewalk next to the Taj Mahal Hotel. It's all barricaded. And so in that sense, when we look back at even Marine Drive is highly policed. Like you constantly have much greater policing of public spaces in Bombay due to various reasons, terrorism or whatever the reason that the state might give you. But there's a much greater policing of public spaces, and you've got the barricades around the Maidan. So there are a lot more physical spatial barriers in present day Bombay around public spaces. And that's a whole sort of can of worms, which is kind of tied to ideas of citizenship and who's Mumbaikar, or who belongs to Bombay and who has access to these spaces. So I don't want to go there, but in that sense, when you look at some of these films, there's a lot of spatial mobility in the films. That is, you have characters who move from, let's say, Bachchan, like, it's like east-west migration. There's it's not just a spatial geography. It's sort of it's an economic geography of Bombay that it represents. And in that sense, when we look at Bachchan gazing out at Marine Drive and reminiscing that scene where he's a little kid with his mother, Nirupa Roy, and those children, they're homeless. They've just come from hinterland. They don't have food to eat. They don't have a place to live. And yet they're able to walk on this space without any restrictions. And that is, again, another sort of testimony to Bombay's cosmopolitanism. And you see that kind of representation of Marine Drive in, let's say, a film like Guru, where Guru is trying to meet Mithun Chakravarti, the editor, but Mithun Chakravarti lives in this apartment where Abhishek Bachchan doesn't have access to him, but he sort of ambushes him on Marine Drive when Mithun Chakravarti goes for his morning walk. And that again shows you like how that Marine Drive is the space which allows the meeting of people from very different backgrounds, ethnicities, class backgrounds. And so it's this space of as a public space, it's a space of cosmopolitanism where you have these very exciting possibilities of people from very different backgrounds who would otherwise have barriers to seeing or meeting each other come together on Marine Drive.
Right.
But then it is aspirational urbanism in the sense that it's planned, it's a homogeneous urban ensemble, and you have to be very rich to own one of those apartments or buildings or Marine Drive. And in that sense, it tends to be that it's not aspirational in terms of like being an occupant of the public space, but it's aspirational in the sense of like owning one of those buildings or even having access to one of those buildings where you have that kind of view that Bachchan has. Like for him to be in that Oberoi hotel, to be in a room, that signifies a certain class privilege. You cannot be there without I mean, you'd go to the rooftop swimming pool restaurant if you had the money, or you kind of lived in the, you were living in the hotel or something. So that signifies a certain privilege, and it's a kind of aspirational urbanism in the sense that that's in the Nehruvian sense, like Art Deco, even though it was constructed during colonial times, it is aspirational in terms of it being a planned ensemble that is built on reclaimed land that is the product of high engineering and the kind of utopia that Nehru envisioned about Indian cities. So when I say like aspirational urbanism, that's what I mean, like comparing it to, let's say, the bazaar urbanism or some of the more organic settlements in Bombay.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, as you're saying, those Art Deco apartments probably are owned privately, but Marine Drive sort of belongs to everyone.
Exactly.
That's incredible. I'll take two more questions. One is, I think, again, this is a good question for both our speakers. A lot of the themes about secularism, socialism, and urban modernity being discussed in the film have a precedent in the early mid to 20th century when a new independent nation was being formed. How do you think Art Deco and the discourses about modernity associated with it fit into this conversation of secularism and socialism? Prof, would you like to take that?
No, one that I can.
So, when I talk to a lot of my colleagues who are historians of Art Deco in the United States, they would often refer to Art Deco as a colonial enterprise. And I think we have to really delve deep into how these Art Deco ensembles in Bombay were built. And then we have to go look into agency, that is, who are the architects, who are the engineers, where did the capital come from, that is, who are the patrons. And if we look at that, Art Deco was a kind of an example of elite indigenous, I shouldn't use the word indigenous actually, but Art Deco is an example of elite urbanism that was propelled by elite Indians who, when we look at the Gothic ensemble, that is very much a colonial project. It's sort of funded by the it was realized by the governor of Bombay, Frere, and but when we look at the Art Deco ensemble, even though the land that was reclaimed was part of a colonial project, but the kind of buildings that came up and the choices of aesthetics, they were all made by independent Indians, architects, and contractors. So in that sense, Art Deco sort of represents a kind of agency, a kind of assertion of cultural autonomy on the part of elite Indians at that time. And there were a number of architects from UK who were closely collaborating with Indian engineers, architects. So it kind of represents this. And if you literally like do a side-by-side comparison of Bombay and Miami Art Deco buildings, there's an incredible synchronicity. That is, they were almost being built at the same time, and they had this similar aesthetics. And so we're now beginning to see this sort of new kind of embracing of this kind of aesthetic by the elite in Bombay. And it's to me, it's really important in the assertion of cultural sovereignty. So, for example, if you look at something like Gateway of India or Victoria Terminus, these were all products of a specific colonial agenda, whether it's in the Saracenic architecture or Gothic architecture. They were all part of very directly a part of the colonial project in representing something that the architects of the British Empire wanted to. But the Art Deco ensembles are really the first sort of planned ensembles in Bombay, so to speak, that represent this kind of cultural autonomy on the part of Indian elite as patrons. That could be Maharajas, entrepreneurs, and then you've got Parsi architects, contractors, engineers. So in that sense, it has a very specific meaning towards the formation of India as a sovereign nation state.
Right. Prof, would you like to add to that?
No, I think everything that Vandana said is very significant. I'd just like to add that the choice of architecture in this cultural autonomy, as Vandana says, is in fact international modernism. Okay, so it stands out very, very clearly with whatever came before, which was the colonial or the imperialist enterprise. Both stylistically, construction-wise, and in terms of the typologies, because you have the rise of the apartment blocks and so on. Which are all part of a cultural enterprise, which is, I would like to say, almost homegrown, rather than top-down, imposed top-down. That is one. The other is that Art Deco as a style, as an aesthetic, is always seen, at least I see it, in Bombay as a completely public, it has a public face, which means that the buildings are intended to be appreciated by the man on the street. So it is not simply that, you have built a building for yourself and so on, but because it is part of the larger urban fabric, it is open to the appreciation of the person who is on the street in the public realm. And I think that is a very, very important reason for its very genuine embrace by the people of the city for this kind of style, which becomes very, very popular in the 30s and 40s.
On this note, I think it's a very interesting exercise to sort of see how urban landscapes are emerging in and represented in cinema. It's a very cool interdisciplinary way of looking at an object. But I think on this note, we can conclude today's session. Thank you so much, Vandana, for graciously sharing your findings and insights with us. Thank you, Professor, for being with us this evening and for engaging in conversation with us. I think, as you're saying, films make a fascinating archive of any city, and we have so many incredible examples of films set in Bombay. So we have a whole repository that we can look at. It's also interesting for us to take a zoomed out view and look at adjacent interests other than just Art Deco in the city. So we also make these connections with Art Deco. I'd also like to thank our audiences for spending their Saturday evening with us. Thank you for supporting us, and I hope you enjoyed this talk. If you would like to get in touch with us regarding the talk or anything else that we've been up to, you can write to us at decomail@artdecomumbai.in. You can also take a look at our work online at artdecomumbai.com, as well as our social media handles on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We're at Art Deco Mumbai, @Art Deco Mumbai. Lastly, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Atul Kumar, Vishaka Bhatt, Ashwini Navate, and Pranjali Mature for working with me to put this event together. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and I hope the rest of your evening is a pleasant one. Thank you.